Hey, I'm Dr. Cindy Haggerton, and my topic to present to you guys is about how we can best support our systems during the fertile years, and so specifically for fertility. A little bit of my background, because when I hear presentations, I like to know who the speaker is and why they're talking about this topic, kind of what authority that they have in this realm. I know that this topic can be a sensitive one depending on what your journey has looked like and where you're at in that. And so just know when you hear the ages of my children that we haven't had an easy peasy journey when it comes to fertility. And that's part of why I love educating people and just giving some resources on things that were really helpful for us when things weren't super simple. And so, speaking of kiddos, our oldest is 13. Makes me feel really old now that I have been doing this parenting thing for teenage years amount now, right? And then we have an 11-year-old. After her, our third had a genetic condition, which we didn't know about until birth, and he passed away shortly after he was born. And during that whole time, we struggled a little while, which I'll cover specifically with our 13-year-old. And just when we decided, hey, it was, a point at which we wanted to grow our family because of some things that we were doing lifestyle wise, and then not supporting systems is where that came into play. And so when we get into this, I'll cover our experience specifically because I'm an easy one to use as an example. But after our third passed away, it took us a year. Obviously, a lot of things playing into that with just emotions and on the grief journey and just the stress that brings into play in order to conceive again. And when we conceived that, which would have been our fourth child, we actually had a miscarriage before we had Witten. And during Witten's pregnancy, which is why it can get confusing when I say their ages, we actually adopted. And so we have the 13, 11, and then Evans would have been almost 8 years old. And then our adopted son is 6. And then his brother, who was our rainbow baby with that pregnancy after the death and then the miscarriage, is almost 6 because they are 7 months apart. So that always makes it fun. And then we have a 1-year-old. So that's just a little bit about that. Before I roll on, hopefully, because you have been hearing about so many incredible products, you have been utilizing those as you're listening to these talks. And so a little bit of freebie information that doesn't really have to do with fertility specifically, because we are going to talk about and cover quite a bit. And I've been told that people prep for my talks with nitros because they haven't heard people talk as fast as I do. And that's just because I want to respect your time, but I realize that we have a lot to cover. And so in that, because your mind may be like, how do I, keep up with all this, whether it's the information or my fast talking or both. One of my favorite oils for memory retention and just to be able to really keep a hold of what you hear is cedarwood. And sometimes that surprises people because we love to talk about this one for like favorite diffuser blends when we're sleeping, but it can actually really help you retain information and focus. And so if you're looking for an oil to utilize while we chat, this one is a great one. Or if you're like, hey, there's a lot of information and I just need some clarity to keep this all straight and clear, we have a blend for that called Clarity. And I love the smell of this one. And so if you haven't experienced this blend, you need this one because it's phenomenal. And especially depending on when you're listening to this and what your day has held. And so let's oil up real quick before we continue chatting about all this information. So you may have seen when they announced the topic of my call that I was going to be covering fertility. And some of you might have jumped on here because you're like, I want to know all the system support for that. Others of you, maybe you're not on this call, but you can tell your friends if that was them, might have been like, that's not for me. And so first things first, I want to preface this now that we have all of our oils on and we can focus and have clarity and concentrate and remember all the things that we talk about, that although we are going to speak about hormones and specifically for women's cycles, for men, how to better support that for people if you're looking to grow your family, or maybe you're looking for like, how can I do prevention with this? But hormones in the fertile years is where I'm going to hone in on and get specific about. But in general, we need to always be thinking about how we support this system, regardless of where we're at on the journey and whether our desire is to grow our family or we want to hold back from that, because fertility, when we talk about that, people tend to put it through this lens of like children, pregnancy, childbirth, all of those things that immediately pop into your head when we start this conversation. But what I want you to back up on and have a big bird's eye view, and when we had our chiropractic practice and we're in office, this is something that we discussed with our patients a lot, is that fertility or the lack thereof is really like your fertility can be equal to how well our health is and how our vitality is doing. And so in that, if we go in and medically address that and we alter it, say with a surgery, or we're taking something, a synthetic chemical to change how that fertility is normally functioning, then we have to remember that we can't do those things in isolation without affecting the whole system and thereby affect our health and vitality to a certain point. And so I just want you to keep that in mind, because it becomes such a bigger conversation than just children or no children. When we talk about our fertility, both for male and female, is really equal to how healthy that is how the overall health of the person is going to be and how their vitality is doing. And so when we put it in that light, then we can look at, hey, everybody, no matter where they're at, needs system support for this. And I even think about that, especially with my preteen and my teen moving into that, but the choices that are affecting that even as their children and during pregnancy. And that's part of why I loved when we were in office, and then what led me into doing so much birth work and eventually to get my midwifery license, that I love sitting down with couples, either when they're pregnant or have young children, or if they're thinking, hey, I want to grow that family. Because sometimes if our mindset isn't on, hey, I want to do this work for me, and we're not focused on like, how can I best support myself in this moment, then we will do it oftentimes for other people more than we'll simply do it for ourselves, right? And so that's a great time when we are more open to putting in work. And that especially becomes true when we talk about the choices that we're making, or the choices that people before us made, affect generations down. And so the things that you're choosing for yourself right now, we're not only going to see the consequences and the results of that, whether they be good or bad, for ourselves, but also for our children, their children, and their children and generations. So because the research just continues to show us that it goes further and further down, further than what we even expected, and both the female and the male side and what they bring to the table affecting that. And so I love this conversation, and I'm so thankful that we don't have to sit here and talk about things that need a change and give you like bad news on maybe some choices that you're really enjoying right now, and then just leave it at that, as like, hey, the bad news person, came to ruin all your fun. Because the good news is that we have products that can help you make that switch, that we can do it without overwhelm, and that we don't have to take the enjoyment out of whatever we're doing right now. Oftentimes, the more we understand what those choices are and what their consequences are, then that mental understanding of that makes the switch so much simpler and easier to stick with. And so as we cover these things, I want you in your notes, if something is an overwhelming piece to you, instead of just shutting down as we often do and letting that overwhelm put the wall there, I often will tell people, take supplements. For instance, they will message me if I post something, on social media that I did to help XYZ, and they're like, I've heard that it's better to take this with that or without that, or do I take it in the morning or night? And I will often say back to them, hey, taken is better than not. And they're like, oh yeah, that's right. And so we really are going to apply to this. Done is better than perfect, right? Because how many times do we allow ourselves to stop? I'm so guilty of this, or to not start to begin with just because something stresses us out. And so when we're talking about hormones, we have to say systems with the S on it, because those hormones and the chemical reactions that happen with them or don't literally affect every part of our body. There's not a function in our body that I can think of that isn't affected by those systems and doesn't need those systems to be well supported. And so I know that because we're talking about such a vast subject, especially when it comes to females, and you'll see like my male part that we talk about on this is really small, because in a male, we will see those hormones change over 24 hours. And so they don't have to look at a full cycle that's typically like textbook around a month like a female does. But same thing, male and female, it affects everything. And so as you're sitting here, if you're like, oh, this is, too much, or there's too many changes that I know as I'm taking my notes that I need to make, just pick one thing from this that you can take and put that into what we call like our Monday morning use, no matter what day of the week that it is, right? And then as we get consistent with that and we're doing it, maybe it's not perfect, but done is better than perfect, right? Then you can slowly add on some other changes that have been in your notes. And so maybe you just highlight the one area that you want to focus on. So when we're talking about this system or any other systems that we want to cover, we have to remember two things. And I alluded to the fact that research is always changing, right? Some of the things that we talk about, maybe there's not research for. And so with that, to keep it simple and to keep it accurate for the moment that we're in right now, anytime the research isn't there, or maybe we don't, have an exact way to pinpoint what we're saying, we want to go back to physiology and to anatomy and the way that we were created to function. And the truth is that your body will continually fight to have that function be at its, what it knows is perfect, which is its homeostasis, its wellness plumb line, if you want. And so sometimes if things are above, a level where that normal is at, the body will constantly be in a state of trying to bring it back down to that middle where it considers perfect. Maybe it's below, and same thing, it'll constantly be fighting to bring it to that normal line. And so what is awesome about that is that we can, no matter, what symptom we know or don't, or if we understand like, hey, what system or organ is this coming from and needs support, we don't have to make it this complicated thing. We can just come back to the fact that physiologically and anatomically, there are things that the body is created to have in order for it to function at perfect at that homeostasis line. And then there are things that it is meant not to have. And we can categorize it even more specific by three ways. And I really like to talk about this when we say hormones, that those stressors or the needs are either going to go in a physical area. So you can make in your notes physical. It may be emotional. So that's where the feeling stuff, if that was like out there to you, I'm going to simplify this for you a little bit. So the physical, the chemical, or the emotional. I may have just said emotional, but chemical is in there too. So I just gave you the third one. And so some of those will overlap as we talk about them, but some of them, maybe, you want to focus on one area more than another, will be really simple to be like, okay, that goes in that category. So how can we analyze if you don't have, a lab right there by you? And if you do, and you just have lab work, whether that was a hair analysis or urine or blood, I like to not just take that as the one thing that I look at. And so you may have been with a practitioner, maybe you yourself are the practitioner, who has before had a reductionistic single viewpoint on this. And maybe you did look at the lab. I can't tell you how many patients have come in before and they're like, well, my thyroid blood work was normal, but even, I've been telling them I have all these symptoms, but because the blood work was normal, we didn't take into account what the thyroid was doing. And so we may have lab work that says one way or the other, but I really want to look at the person as a whole in a holistic fashion, which may be different if you've been in this reductionistic model of like, I'm just going to look at the thyroid, or I'm just going to look at, what the liver is doing, or the brain, or, mom's fertility, if we're looking at her hormones a little bit more. And the fact is, even as a person holistically, but we have to look at the whole unit of like the family of what is going on, because we know, especially when we're talking about fertility, we bring two to the table on that, right? And so if there is lab work, yes, that can be a part of the picture that we look at, but we don't want to be the singular thing that we get really roped into and not look at all the other things that the full picture is telling us. And so aside from that, you can still check in with yourself with or without that lab view of what the chemicals are doing, and kind of see, how are you feeling? How are your body temperatures? It is not normal, although it may be common depending on who you're talking to and the circles that you're running in. And so common, just because everybody around you has it, or that's been your experience, that does not mean it's normal, right? And so how are our temperatures? I'm going to give you some specific mapping of how you can look at that and when you can look at it if you want to use that as a gauge. But if you are someone who walks into me, and this, by the way, caveat, is not me, talking to you as your provider. We're all just friends here. I'm a mom sharing what, yes, I have seen in a practice setting, but also I want you to know what has worked for me personally, and then just what I have seen work for other families. And so please don't take this as advice from your provider. You know your body best, and so you can go in And take that however you want. But this is just me giving you some helpful suggestions. But it is not normal if you, in the temperature realm, if we are talking about that, are one who comes in and says like, hey, my ears and my nose constantly cold, my hands, my feet, I just can't get them warm at night. And so if that is the case, then temperatures are probably going to lead us to the fact that those hormone systems are needing more support. Maybe they're getting something that they're not meant to have. Maybe they're not getting the support that they're meant and made for, or maybe it's a little bit of a combo of both. But how can we look at that temperature clue to tell us if we need or don't need to make some adjustments there as far as support goes, right? We may look at some other things like hair. How is that doing as far as like texture? How is the amount of it? Do you notice that there have been changes in that? And how does that for a female correspond to what your cycle is doing? And so on that cycle, one of my favorite ways to track this is a combo way of both looking at mucus, so specifically female cervical mucus, and then also looking at temperature. Yes, you can look at either one without the other, but if we have both, that just gives us more of the full view picture. And again, we want to take into account what I was saying earlier, the full month. I do quotations because your cycle days may be a little bit different and not at the textbook, 28 to 30 that you hear of. And so what is your experience for you? When we look at that, if you are going to chart looking at that mucus and that temperature, or you just want to know what the length of it is, day one would be the first day that that female notices bleeding. And then we go all the way until that next first day of bleed, which is the day one. And so the day right before that first day of bleeding, again, would be the last day of the cycle. So by textbook, you're going to hear anywhere from day one being over here all the way to 28 or 30 days before she experiences that day one again, right? And so there may be, depending on the female, fluctuation in what that cycle length looks like. But what we really want to focus on is by that temperature and her cervical mucus. Hopefully we have both. And you can Google this. I'm not going to go through a whole thing about reading. My favorite method on this, and you can find people who, practitioners, coaches, I don't know how they label them specifically, but there are experts in this field who will sit down with both the male and the female couple and teach them, regardless of what they're trying to do, whether it's growing or preventing family size, they will teach them how to monitor their cycles. And again, when we're talking about that fertility, showing us our health and vitality and where that's at or how much support that system needs, I love sitting down with them and learning the proper way of tracking this and charting it, because you can see issues long before they are officially, diagnosed or occur, based on knowing how your body functions. And because you're with you more than anyone else, you are the expert on your body. And so it is so nice in a culture where I find that we don't get a lot of conversation around this. We don't get a lot of support in that, to have an outside view come in and give you a full picture of like, hey, this is how we monitor that. This is normal. This is not. And so when we're looking at that, what we want to see, that beginning part of the cycle on day one starts the follicular phase. At ovulation until the end of that cycle, you're going to be in what is called the luteal phase. This will become important because I'm mentioning it right now. No matter what the days are that follicular cycle occurs in, we want to ideally see, and if we don't, then we know, hey, this is a clue that we need some more support on that luteal phase from ovulation until the last day of her cycle before she starts that day one again. We want those days to be the same in number. And so, yes, the whole cycle, we want to see that even out to where it's pretty much the same in length, but really in a focused area on that luteal second half of the cycle, we want that to be the same. Okay, so for men, we're going to talk about in a 24-hour period, things turn over and start a lot faster than the female, but with the female, we're looking at a full month in that, right? And so on that gives you a little bit of clues. And so if we're talking cervical mucus, and again, if you're not meeting with somebody in the Creighton model who comes in and is the practitioner expert in that to teach you how to monitor and read those cycles and what they are not telling you with your charts, then there's plenty of information on Google. One of my favorite books, it's thick, so don't let that overwhelm you, but it's called Taking Control of your fertility. It is phenomenal. And for, breastfeeding moms around perimenopause, you can get tons of information. So grab that thick book. You can, flip through it, but then you can go topically to the places that apply specifically to where you're at and look at that. But when we talk about temperature monitoring, and males can do this too, because I'm not just talking about cycles with this too, upon awakening in the morning, this works the best and is the most accurate when we've had a full, so 7 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, right? If your sleep is kind of all over the place, like I find myself with my 1-year-old right now, who isn't knowing the loveliness and the gift that is sleep yet. And so I could still monitor mine in the mornings, but they're not going to be as accurate as they will be when she starts learning how beautiful it is to sleep those full nights through, right? But upon awakening, before you move around, if you've played sports before, you know what happens when you get to moving and playing, your temperature goes up, right? And so in order to get this accurate and see what our metabolism is doing, which tells us a lot about our hormones, immediately upon awakening, you'll hear a basal body thermometer. The reason why they say that is because there's just more decimals in the reading that it's going to give you. And so it will help you on accuracy. So that's the one that you want to get. If you have another thermometer, so long as you can just really tell the degrees on that, because we really do want to get as accurate as we can on that. And again, male and female. And so upon awakening, and then after the first meal, wait about 30 minutes, would be another time to get that reading, but especially that upon awakening. And then mid-afternoon, when you would tend to get like your afternoon slump, that would be another time to read that. And this, and doing these readings several different times, not only gives us a broader view and more numbers to pull from, but what we want to see that temperature doing, especially upon the awakening, we want to see it on an average between 97.8 to 99 degrees, right? And so if we're below or above that range, then that just gives us a little bit of a clue to the whole picture, to the whole puzzle piece as to whether or not our systems need a little bit more support, specifically talking about our endocrine system. But when we get that reading after we've eaten something, or like in the afternoon one, like the awakening one, is going to give us an idea of how the hormones are doing, how we are not handling stress. After eating, if we wait about 30 minutes to take that temperature, it's going to tell us how well we're nourishing our system, or maybe there's an allergen in there on that whole thing about what the body's created, not to have. And so maybe we need to support with some extra enzymes, or maybe our Digest blend is phenomenal as we work on that whole hormonal system, right? But temperature wise, that can give you a lot. I mentioned the mucus, and so you can look at with the Google or working with your Creighton practitioner on that. But the other piece that the male and female can both take into account too, along with that temperature, is pulse. And so we can do that on the wrist, we can do it on the neck. Again, you can Google if you're not familiar with how to get accurate readings on that. But that pulse range that we want to find ourselves in, and we can do same timing on the immediately, but before you've moved around when you wake up, to that first meal that you eat, about 30 minutes to an hour after that. And then again in that afternoon, most people, it's between 2 and 4 p.m. when we experience that afternoon slump. And so we can take those pulse readings, and you want to find that pulse between 75 and 90 beats per minute. I can talk, that would help, right? So evening time, mine would be showing you that they are in the stressed out range as I'm trying to recall all this information that I want to give you guys, right? And so that and those pieces of information will help you kind of read with or without the labs, and then gauging on just, how you're feeling and how you're functioning overall, and taking that whole thing into account. Like, hey, do we have a content systems right now, or do we need to add in some more support, or maybe we need to take out some stressors in that? And so when we're talking specifically physical, if I'm thinking through organs with you guys, I want to talk a little bit about brain, neurologically, how we support those things. Liver is a really big one. You've probably heard about liver filtering. Truth is, liver also, we need to make sure with that whole well-nourished conversation that liver is able to hold things and to process appropriately. And so we'll chat about that and some products that we have for helping you support that system. And then when we're talking about hormones, specifically reproductive, yes, but really with all after 2020, and most, people that I talked to experienced it before 2020, but then after it kind of leveled the playing field for everybody, right? Is our endocrine system. And so talking about your adrenals and your thyroid specifically. And so if you're tired of those, what may feel to you buzzwords, spoiler alert, we can't stop the conversation about those guys because they are still handling a lot of stress for us. And if we are thinking grow our family, whether or not you are, I'm thinking that in terms of your health and vitality. How well do you think if you're in a major stressful event? So we had a physiology teacher in chiropractic college that used to compare it to white tiger, running from the white tiger. And so maybe for you, that's not your most stressful event. But if we talk back to like caveman brain, primitive, when we were created, how the body would function, what was it meant to do? Yes, you would have bursts of maybe running from that tiger when you would have a little bit of stress, but then hopefully you got away and you were able to sit down and take a breather after that stressful event and recover, right? But what most of us, if we're being honest, experience in our current day and age is that stressor. Either it's not the ending point of you being able to sit down, or we are experiencing those more closely and continually together to where those bursts of, I can sit down and take a breather, are happening too far in between those stressful moments. And when we think of it in that, how much do you think your body is going to want to slow down and thinking about creating a human, giving it all the nutrients that it needs to grow healthily and appropriately in a time frame, and then be able to focus on, hey, I'm in a safe place to let this baby out and go into labor and have a birth and have all of the recovery from that? Probably not very well. And that's probably not on the forefront of your primitive brain if you're worried about running from a tiger. And so that is why we have to have these conversations about how can we support this endocrine system that is experiencing a lot of stress. Oftentimes the peaks of that stress are higher than what it was meant to experience, and they're closer together. And so we have to, and that may be why you feel like this has been a buzz fad thing about everybody's talking about their thyroid or their adrenals or endocrine as a whole, or maybe cortisol. The hormone has come up a lot in that, but that is why we have to have that conversation. And so just to narrow down, I loved in practice, and we had this conversation a lot, that with Young Living, when we talk about products for this, we have hundreds, right? Either that's you online and you've got a lot of scrolling to get through all the products, or if you have, paper catalog in front of you, it's pretty thick, right? And so where that could be a conversation of like, I don't know where to start, or there's just so many things that I could use to support this. Yes, we could look at that and like have the whole overwhelm, eyes gloss over come over us. Or we could be like from the other, let's flip that narrative. Hey, I have so many things that I can choose from to start making changes with and get in these good habits, and seeing what works best for me. And then as I'm establishing that, and I feel like I'm in a place where it's not going to stress and overwhelm me out, to add on more things, then we can do that. So that's the piece of the conversation that I love. So in that tonight, as I cover, or tomorrow during the day, whenever you're watching this, as I cover what you can utilize, I may talk about something that I have had great experience with, and it may not be your favorite product, or you may love to support this system with another product. That doesn't mean that either of us is wrong. I just have a short amount of time in which to cover this with you. And so I've just picked some of my heavy hitters. And so on that note, when we're talking about the physical, chemical, and emotional stressors, if you've heard my husband before, this was actually our gateway into this whole Young Living thing and why I'm sitting before you tonight. If you were just going to make one change, and especially talking because I told you about how many kids that I have. And so yes, they're in our cabinets. Yes, I'm encouraging them to help me clean. If there was one place in your household that I was like, hey, this is the biggest bang for your buck and the most like simple, effective change that you can make, it is into our Thieves line, and specifically our Thieves household cleaner. And the reason I say that is that when I was giving you that whole, hey, it's typically a month-long cycle talk about what we're doing with our follicular phase and our luteal, and we're going to chat more about this when I talk about products that support these specific hormones. At the beginning of that part of your cycle, the whole follicular phase, estrogen It tends to be dominant, should be. That should be the norm. And once ovulation happens and those hormones that were up start to fall, in a male, we're going to see in that 24 hours, typically in the morning, that testosterone is going to peak. And then throughout the day, it's going to lower a little bit until it's at its lowest. And then again in the morning, we're going to see it peak again. And so he will do a 24-hour cycle. But for the female, in order for that estrogen to fall, we see the progesterone rise. And so we have a teeter-totter inverse relationship with each other. Well, guess what? Environmentally, whether it's from you having other cleaning synthetic things in your house, oftentimes on the ingredients, if they list fragrance, that's kind of a whole bucket that can take a whole bunch of things that maybe aren't just fragrance by themselves, but I can have a whole bunch of chemicals, and legally all I have to do is label it fragrance. And so oftentimes when we see fragrance on there, a lot of synthetic things tend to have an estrogenic effect on the body. Maybe it's not from cleaning supplies. Maybe it's from makeup that the female is using. Maybe she has other toiletries that have more of an estrogen-like base. The problem with it is not natural to our body. And so the body will read it as estrogen, but it functions a little bit different than the estrogen that our body makes. And so it reads it. But the bigger thing and the bigger concern, and why we want to take this load and take some of the stress off of that with, okay, where's an easy, switch to make that I'm talking about this Thieves Household Cleaner due on, is if I am being bombarded from the outside, and there's a certain amount of that we can control, there's other amounts that I can't. If I'm on a run outside and I run by somebody's yard, or say I borrow, some clothes from someone, I'm not going to control what they're using in their yard and whether that has estrogen that adds to my stress load or not, or what they're washing their clothes in, even if I'm, around a friend. And so there's only a certain amount of that we can control. And so I love that we do have control over things, especially in our household, so that we can take as much stress off of that system and not add to the load. And then we let our body have a little bit of that, I can sit down from the stressful situation. And so if I'm being bombarded by that estrogen, maybe it doesn't stress out the beginning of my cycle as much, because the body's like, okay, estrogen's supposed to be high. But what happens if that estrogen never lets off because of those stressors, and if we don't see a decline in that, chances are with that inverse relationship, we're not going to see progesterone able to do what it is supposed to do and rise up, right? Because the body's saying, hey, keep the progesterone low. This estrogen is still climbing high. So with that, especially with a mind like, are the kids going to help? Even if nobody does anything with me with the Thieves Household Cleaner, what are we doing? I'm touching, my desktop that I've sprayed that with. I'm walking around in my house barefoot. My baby's crawling around in that. She's licking, things on the tabletop. Sorry if you're coming over to dinner. Spoiler on that. But good thing is Thieves works without stressing our body out, right? And so I can, especially for knowing all of the members in my household and the fact that I have, both male and female, take so much stress off of the load of my family's hormonal system and give major system support by switching to something like Thieves Household Cleaner that isn't going to add in those estrogen effects to the body. And so if that's the only thing that you put on your notes and the one change that you choose to walk away from this with, great. If you're like, hey, I'm already got it on the Thieves Household Cleaner, what's some other places? Maybe we look at switching out toothpaste next, because that mouth is hugely vascular, right? And so what we put in there, even if we're not swallowing it, it's getting taken to the rest of the body. And maybe that is where you're finding that your toxin load is getting added to, and thereby stressing out your hormonal system. And so yes, that would be another great place. Detergents, because we're wearing our clothes all day long, right? And so I love that our Thieves detergent, laundry detergent, cleans things. Tons of stain remover hacks that you can do with that too. And our Thieves bar soap and stuff, and not add stress to a system. When our skin is our largest organ, it's absolutely absorbing things, and we're in this stuff all day long, not to mention what we're breathing from it. So there is a great way just with that you can make huge changes. Something in the hormonal system that people may not even realize is affecting them. When we talk about our brain, we had, and you may have heard of him, Dr. Amen, medical doctor who is an absolute genius, especially when it comes to the brain specifically. He came and gave a presentation, and it made such an impression on me that I will never forget this. And so I want to share the little picture that he painted for us, if this is helpful to you in understanding this. So much of what we talk about that's happening in the body hormonally starts in the brain, right? Because the organs that either release those hormones or tell the organs that are releasing them to release them or not to release them and what to do are housed in the brain. And so because I mentioned the thyroid to you guys, we'll talk about specifically with thyroid labs. A lot of times people will only get a small picture that doesn't give the full view of that with their thyroid. And they'll come in and we hear a lot about TSH, right? Well, your TSH is actually more controlled by your pituitary. It's more of what I like to think of as a pituitary hormone, which is housed in the brain. It's really small little organ at the base of the brain stem, actually. And so with that pituitary, we tend to think TSH, thyroid, until we have that whole conversation. But Dr. Amen was talking about, and I joke, like never say never, because I sat in this class long before we had started our family. And I was like, after that information, my boys will never play, name the sport. I think he was mentioning football players specifically. But he talked about the brain organ, and he was saying if we want to get a really good visual of what that is like, it is like a slab of butter sitting out on the counter that hasn't been in the fridge or in the freezer. And so if we think about the brain, for some reason a lot of people visualize that as a lot harder texture wise than what it actually is. And he was like, no, that organ is actually like butter that has been sitting out. And he said, and then we go to the cranium and those bones, like your skull, that is encasing that. And there's actually, so that is actual hard bone, but there are pieces of that, especially when we get into the interior part. And when we're talking about this part of the brain, pituitary, with the hormones specifically, that skull bony encasing that houses that soft, buttery brain organ is actually has some spiny parts that stick out, and it's bone, just like you go and you knock on it. And so he was like, let's picture trauma. And so I was saying, he probably was referring to football, if I remember it correctly. But even if you've had a car accident, as I'm watching my toddler and she's, doing all these things now with learning to run and, trying out wrestling with her brothers. And so we have all of these physical experiences our whole life through, some of us more than others, that can allow that soft, buttery organ to be rustled around inside that bony, encasement. And then we don't, until years later, maybe the symptoms of what we're experiencing stop us and make us look back on that. But otherwise, we don't often think a whole lot about that. And I bring that up because this can absolutely, if we look at the physical part of this, when we're talking about that triad that I mentioned to you guys, it can absolutely affect our hormonal system. And so maybe with the resources, and I love Team YL because I see you guys bring this up like, hey, I'm here, who do you recommend with this? Or maybe you've never heard of this before. And so you're like, maybe I need to look into a practitioner. And so for us, chiropractically, we definitely took those things into account. Maybe that, caused us to look at addressing alignment in the part of the body with this. And so obviously with your Young Living products, we're not going to talk about, practitioner specific stuff, but yes, like sacral therapist, or maybe your occupational therapy or chiropractic, you might want to look into that more if the physical stressors or something that, like, as I'm talking about that, you're like, hey, that totally, jogs my brain about this memory with that. But if someone comes in and we know or we suspect that that pituitary is stressed or alignment, that we need some more support for that, look into, you can grab your essential oil desk reference, or you can go to your favorite group or the person that invited you to this with link and stuff. And wherever that favorite support is, we all, if we've heard about it before, who have education on it, are huge fans of the raindrop technique. And that has done amazing things for supporting the physical structure. And so if you're like, hey, I want some more support in that, I would definitely look into raindrop. Raindrop with somebody who is certified in it and knows all the ins and outs and specifics of that is fantastic. But I'm not certified in it, grabbing the kit and then the info sheet, and that gives you plenty of information to work with. If you don't have somebody to apply them to your spine, you can absolutely grab it and apply it to your feet. You can do it to your ears. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can support yourself with or without help with that. And if you haven't had a certification before. And so that is one of my favorite kits when we're talking about, hey, the body needs some physical support. Frankincense, we can grab that oil specifically. I love this technique. If the label is white, I was like, I don't have a Vitality one in here, but let's say cedar wood's not even, let's pretend this is frankincense because that's what I'm talking about, right? If your oil bottle is the color red with that label, or if you have your frankincense vitality, that's the white, they are the same oil inside the bottle. The bottle is just labeled different to help with regulation, to show us that one can be utilized internally as a supplement versus the other. And so frankincense is a vitality. So that's what, for the purposes of this video, I'm telling you to do this with the vitality oil, but use what you have on hand. And so if you want to, with the colored label and the piece of your own home, do your own that, it is the same oil. And so for somebody, especially because we know where we were just saying this organ's at, if I want to get as close to that as possible with the brain, yes, I could apply that like on the back of my neck, how you guys saw me start this call out, but you can also drop a couple of drops of that frankincense and then press it to the roof of your mouth like you're sucking your thumb. And that will do phenomenal things for helping to support that system and get you as close to that area as we talked about. And so both on the back topically, and then love pressing that to the roof of the mouth with frankincense or any of your other oils that you want to do to support that specifically. So those two things with thieves and then moving to the physical support with that can be huge on supporting those hormonal systems in the fertile years, right? Chemically, we mentioned bombarded with estrogens. Maybe we want to start making some other changes and so get comfortable with the thieves line. And then slowly but surely you can start looking at some other things. Hey, do I want to look at, Savvy as my makeup a source? Are my toiletries like what we talked about? And so Young Living, because of that thick catalog and all the areas to scroll through, we can fully pretty much switch over everything in our household and stuff that is coming on our body to help with that chemical support. Now, if we know what is going on in the cycle when we're talking about chemicals for the female specifically, with the males, I will give you some support. But again, with that 24 hours, maybe you address the timing of the day, but we don't have to look at that whole cycle. And then if the female, for whatever reason, maybe it's breastfeeding, or maybe she's entering perimenopause around that, or menopausal, and so she doesn't know specifically, then you can adjust. And again, you know your body the best for what you feel like is going on, or maybe you bring in some outside support just to give you a better read of that. But if she is monitoring her cycle and she is a cycling female, you may have heard, oh, with our Progestance Plus, which is a serum blend, it's not an essential oil, even though it has essential oils in it, but it is a fantastic blend specifically for supporting normal progesterone levels in the body. And so oftentimes I will read, and I've even told people before, like, hey, you can use that your whole cycle. But if I want to look at what the body is doing physiologically, what it's meant to have and what it's not, if we know that at the beginning of her cycle, estrogen is usually the star of the show, and then ovulation all the way until that last day of the cycle before she has the bleed again, progesterone is the star of the show. When would I want to use oils and then a serum that specifically supports progesterone? Yes, in the second half of the cycle. And so we have heard people before say, hey, I started utilizing this, and then all of a sudden I was like having headaches, or my emotions were ragey, all over the place. What we know environmentally, there are very few cases where people will not need that progesterone support. Maybe it's, because she's using it outside of when it's the star of the show in her cycle. But most of the time, typically it'll take a few months in order for hormone support or whatever changes we're making to start showing itself even in lab work. And so in that, blood that is circulating around. And so if those first few months are just in that surface area of like, hey, this is changing the blood, when do we think we see actual major levels change and organs start to shift and then systems start to shift? It's usually a few months into that we see it start to get into the organs, and then a few months after that we get into the whole system. And so oftentimes what we're seeing when these symptoms come up is this is the first time the body has had some major support or has taken out the things that were stressing it. And all of a sudden it's like, I do not know what to do with this. And so that whole like processing confusion that's going on can look like the body throwing other symptoms. That's not saying, hey, this isn't the right support. It's just saying, give me a minute to kind of regulate myself and find where that homeostasis normal level is that I'm fighting to get to. And along the way, it may not be an easy peasy journey. And so that's why we look at the long game of this, because oftentimes these stressors that came along didn't stress the system out overnight. And so we need to give it a minute before we just decide, hey, this isn't for me. And so maybe you're adjusting the dose and you're starting out on a lower amount than what you originally tried and just seeing how the body does with that, but give it a little bit before we throw so many changes at it. And so if we're wanting to look at a blend like progestins, which is like the main one that you will hear about when we talk about hormone support, then let's look at doing that in the second half of the cycle. I usually like to have the female ovulate and then wait a day and have her start it, because sometimes if we're using it through the whole cycle, again, this is really rare because most people see their estrogen being so bombarded that adding in some progestins, even if they use it through the whole cycle, it's not going to throw their system off. But sometimes if it's getting it from an outside source and it's like, hey, my progesterone's off, then it can throw that ovulation off. And so if we really want to look at what the body is normally doing in that cycle and should do on a normal, not on a common, then we want to use that in the second half. If we're coming and zooming out and taking in a bigger picture, both for the male and the female, and honestly for all ages across the board, whether she's cycling or not, when we talked about that endocrine system, my favorite support for this, and you really can't go wrong with this blend, it is so, I feel like we're talking about it a little bit more, but it really needs to be like the star, talked about so much more than what it is called Endoflex. It's a blend, fantastic support in it. It smells really good, and it does such a fantastic job of offering overall system support. So working with moms, parents, even grandparents, it is so common that we will hear, hey, little Johnny's having this like spit up issue, or he doesn't act happy, with this diet with his skin. And so we talk about digestion and when they're pooping or not and what their skin is doing. And then like, hey, they're going to school and they're testing. And so how can I support their brain? But so often we don't have this conversation with children, parents, supporting their hormonal system, because we just have this view of like, hey, we'll talk about that when something goes wrong, or I don't want to do something on hormonal support because what if it throws, their cycles off? And so why is it that it is normal to support all these other systems, but yet the system that so often affects every system, we're just completely ignoring when the environment is definitely throwing stressors at it all over the place? And so that is what I love about Endoflex, is that we can come in with a simple blend. So many times the older they get, they love doing this on their own. There is a roller top, depending on how you came into Young Living and what products you have or not. If you had a kit that you grabbed with the kit of oils in your diffuser, there's that little flap. Sorry if this is news to you and you threw it away without knowing that that was there. But under that flap, there's a bunch of hidden gems in there. And some of those, most of them, have 2 rollers in there that you can convert either your small 5 ml bottle or your 15 ml to a roller. I love doing this with Endoflex. And so if you didn't grab Endoflex with your kit, or you haven't yet experienced that blend, grab it on your next order tonight, so you have it when you need it, and you're not missing out on that, and you can start using it as soon as it comes in. Pop that roller fitment on top of it. And then we love, like we're talking about with the temperature thing, after you've tested the temperature, or maybe with your kiddos, as soon as they awake, if you're not doing temperature on them, right over where that like Adam's apple cartilage would be on a male, with a female, kind of in the same area, like middle of your neck, you can roll it there. And then where you would, I'm going to show myself a boy mom, kidney punch somebody. We did that in office to test their kidneys too. So it really is a chiropractic thing, but I always get comments that it's a boy mom. At the end of your rib cage in the back where your kidneys sit, your adrenal glands sit over those, same area. And so both places in the back, and then over your neck, roll that Endoflex upon awakening in the morning. And then you can do it again when that mid-afternoon slump would get, or if you get it at other times during the day, you can absolutely do that. We love to refer to this blend as our tantrum tamer too, because guess what? When we support the hormonal system, no matter the age, we tend to feel better, right? Especially when we're talking about hormones that affect stress. And so that is a great habit to get into. Endoflex is also a vitality oil, and I mentioned that it has a great taste, and so people like to add it into their Ningxia, maybe a drop or 2 directly under the tongue. Smells great for your breath, and so that blend will become a household favorite if you use it. And both male and female, young, old, everybody gets that Endoflex in their system, because everyone that I know could use a little bit of extra endocrine support these days. And so that is a great way to chemically do that. And so if we've talked about for everybody, above, looking at what the cycle is doing specifically. And then we talked about that second half with our Protestants Plus. If you're looking to grow your family, or maybe you weren't, now you find yourself pregnant, and you have been consistently using that Protestants Plus, that is something that we recommend you don't come off of. And so obviously work with your provider. Once you find yourself pregnant, that is a great one to stay on, because what happens in pregnancy, and the reason we don't see that period start again, is because those progesterone levels continue to rise, and then eventually the placenta will take that over. But that is something that people have used throughout their pregnancy and done great with it. And so we would just not recommend, if you've done it on the second half of your cycle, to come off of that. And so continue using that progestins and then work with your provider on that. That is the best way that I have seen people do with that. At the beginning of the cycle, our oil that supports estrogen and those systems specifically, you would want to look at clary sage or blends that have it in it. And then again, once ovulation happens, or if we know, right when that's about to, we can come off of that clary sage, and then we would switch, like we talked about, to those progesterone supporting oils, but then we can stay on Endoflex the whole way through, right? For males specifically, because we mentioned that testosterone in addition to the Endoflex when we're talking about oils, Mister is a great blend specific for males. And so maybe you utilize that first thing in the morning, using it throughout your day, just paying attention, to when your body does best with that blend. And then Dr. Purser, who helped Young Living develop our awesome vitamin mineral complex master formula. He also was the one who helped with the development of that Progestins Plus. He is a genius, but he has done some research specifically on Idaho blue spruce. And so if we're wanting to look at testosterone support specifically, you guys can go research that, but there are ways to do capsules with it, even though it's not a vitality, and then using that topically to support testosterone, if that is something that needs specific support. And then another supplement star that I feel like isn't talked about enough with this, and it is because of the herbal in that supplement specifically called tribulus that supports the system. And testosterone, even though we refer to it most often when talking about males, females actually have a little bit of that in their system, and at certain times need more than others. And so you can look up for females signs of deficiency in testosterone to see if you need support with this. But I love the endocrine support that it offers for both male and females, and have a lot of females who take it and do great on it, even though people will get pigeonholed into this thought process that is a supplement just for men, or that is only for athletes. And I actually find that neither is true, even though obviously those populations can benefit from it. But the tribulus herb in that one is phenomenal, and it's Powergize that I'm referring to specifically for that. And so for males on supplements specific, look at Powergize, but females may find that one really useful too, especially in cases where there's a lot of endocrine stress. Okay. All right. And that liver that we talked about, we've come through brain, we've talked about female with the endocrine system in general, liver, again, both for male and female. Just like with that whole estrogen conversation that is causing a lot of stress, most of us have a lot of things that are stressing out that liver organ too. Yes, the environmental things that I talked about with estrogen, but there's even more that comes into play with that. And so if you have not researched, and I love that this word has become so common in households after 2020, glutathione and just all of that chemical specifically is meant to do and does in your body. Look at that. And then I love another vitality oil, but again, you've got just the regular orange label one, you can use that one, our orange. And so do some research on orange and glutathione, and then you'll understand why we love that one for supporting the liver and all that it can do with your hormones and with your digestion. And so another thing, just like with your Endoflex, that you can pull into your day, again, for the whole family, and just get in a consistent habit with this, is utilizing your orange oil, both topically, and then that's another great one that we can add into our drinks, or maybe you cook with it. And so that one is fantastic in your ningxia and also in your water. But then topically, if we're wanting it to go directly on our liver, on our rib cage, when we're standing your right side, so not mine, depending on where this pointing is happening on your screen. My liver is on my right side, yours is on your right side. At where your rib cage ends in the front, if you just apply it down where that last rib is at on the right hand side, that orange, that'll go directly over your liver. Any of our products that are labeled Juva, so we've got our Juva Tone, our Juva Flex supplements, and your oils. Juva specifically refers to liver, and so if you need some more liver support, you could look at those. Our GLF stands for gallbladder liver function, and so that blend is another phenomenal one that just gets a little bit stronger on that liver support. And so anytime we want to talk about hormone support, we have to talk about the liver, and that is a great thing just on a daily basis, regardless of whether we know, hey, there's some stress there or not, just to get in the habit of supporting, because life in general tends to be really stressful on the liver. And if we haven't seen symptoms of that, we do tend to see them when we start looking at hormones and what those are doing, right? And so that is one of my favorites. And yes, your kids can absolutely benefit from you starting that liver support and healthy liver habits at a young age. All right, let me glance through this and just make sure. And since we touched on that, and I think I mentioned earlier, alluded to saying enzymes, our digestion plays a huge part in our hormones, right? Specifically when we're talking liver, cholesterol, and we don't need to get in because that's like a whole nother talk that we could spend a whole hour on. But our cholesterol is the building blocks of our hormones. And because of how digestion plays into that, especially when we're talking about taking things in from the environment that our body has to have in order to function like it is supposed to, and then keeping things out, that is all a part of the digestive system. And so just like we need healthy neurology, and we talked about physical things to support the brain, we also, the more we support that digestive system, we'll see a better support of the hormone system, because we can't look at these things in a reductionistic viewpoint. And so when we're talking about supporting the liver, we can also get into digestive. And another change, if you're like, hey, I'm doing all those and I'm seeing great results with it, or I'm utilizing most of this, another thing that I see people have great results with on supporting their hormonal system, especially in the fertile years, is with using another product that we so often are like, oh, I'm not working out, I don't need to take that, but it is our AminoWise. And that is because the branch chain amino acids in there, and you will hear pregnant moms, if you haven't yet, a lot of times people talk about protein when we're talking about hormones, that protein building blocks of stuff too, just like what we're saying with the cholesterol. And so we have seen so much research in the area. You may have heard of it before, but your microbiome, which is just your balance of your bacteria in your body. And so we need balance in order for that to be healthy. But those branch chain amino acids can play a huge role in the body, not only developing that good bacteria, but also keeping it balanced. And yes, bacteria is good. We don't look at that as bad. We just want it in balance. And so when we're supporting, whether it's healthy blood sugar or other parts of the system for those hormones, I love our AminoWise product. Put it in some cold water. It tastes great. You can absolutely mix it in your Ningxia. And yes, you've heard me say Ningxia several times now, because it is our overall antioxidant, which if we've had stress to the system is going to help us to better deal with that. But also it has so many parts of it that make it a superfood. And so it is just fantastic as just a regular like baseline thing that we do. And so why not add in some of these other supplements if we're looking at a way to get that into the system, both for male and female. That is a phenomenal one. And then further researching this, since we're talking about adrenals, your highest concentration, one of the parts in your body that has the highest concentration of vitamin C, but your vitamin C is used in other processes than just in this organ alone, is your adrenal glands. And so because there is a high concentration of that there, then it would stand to be and to reason that when we get vitamin C, that organ functions better, right? And so our Super C Chewable is my favorite on that, because it is more whole food based than our other one. And so I love that product. And so if you're looking for other things to add in for hormone support, that can be a great one. And then your mineral essence. I come to give you bad news about this one. If you're one of the ones that's like with the taste, because you've tasted it before, and just at the mention of me saying that name, that you're like, oh, why is she going to say that? Or your brain jumps automatically to, yeah, I can throw it in my bath, or I can rub it on my skin. Yes, those things are true, but we do want to use it as it was designed, and it's labeled on the bottle, taking it by mouth, sublingually under the tongue specifically. The worse it tastes, usually people are more deficient in those minerals. Besides just the minerals that it has in it, which love the seed to seal story on this, that those minerals are from our Great Salt Lake in Utah. Hopefully you'll fly over this year coming into convention and you'll get to see that, because it really is a wonder to behold and love that that's where our minerals in that product come from. But other than just minerals, it has royal jelly in it and our essential oils. And so research the ingredients in it, because if you're anything like me, understanding the benefits of that can help you to do hard things, and you can do hard things. Just squirt it under your tongue, tell yourself if it's tasting really bad, hey, I really need this. And then you can chase it down with some Ningxia or something else that you enjoy the taste of. You can hold your breath while you're doing it. But every hormonal process that I know of needs minerals and needs them balanced. And most of us are so deficient, which is why we will hear commonly people talk about, hey, just put it in your bath or make a capsule out of it. All fine. But that sublingual area, you have got a massive amount of vascular support there that can take that. So there's a lot of blood flow under that tongue that can take it to every cell in your body that needs it. And so we need to get that mineral essence in, and we can't have conversations about supporting any system really, but specifically our hormones, without talking about our need for minerals and how awesome it is that we have a product like this with our oils and our royal jelly, in addition to our mineral complex, in order to start adding in on a consistent basis. And so get consistent with that one too, to support those systems. Okay. Last but not least, because I've given you guys plenty of things that you can add in on a daily basis in order to support those systems. And I don't want you, again, shutting down and overwhelming. So I'll give you a couple more points that come up in the conversation piece. I love that the things that we have talked about with system support on this can continue to support you as the seasons and these stages change for you. And so if that's, hey, you know, I'm supporting my system this way, and then now, you know, for females, I'm perimenopause, or as males and you're aging and your hormones are declining to normal levels as they do with age, regardless of where we find ourselves. Or, you know, you're doing this on your children, can you continue this with them as they age and their hormones, you know, start to peak? Or maybe you find yourself pregnant, and hey, is this safe to continue with that? Obviously working with your providers, but all of these are recommendations that you can use no matter what the season finds you in order to support health and vitality, which is really our fertility and where that's at and what is normal for what season you're in. So on that note, people will, in this whole looking at how can I best make sure that my body is healthy enough to grow and support another body or bodies, in the case of multiples, they will come and say, okay, we've done this and now we find ourselves pregnant. What do we do for prenatals? Or, you know, do we stop that stuff? And so I covered some of that with you guys. You can obviously, with your health, and we encourage you to make the choice that is best for you. But my problem with most prenatals, and what you will see if you talk to enough people or you think through just the sense of this, is that first of all, when we're talking about supplements, and what I love about our supplements and our oils, again, I like something that is whole food based, that is not, you know, massively denatured with these synthetics added in it. When we're talking about B vitamins, which I didn't mention, are super Bs. Your hormonal processes, specifically fertility, requires so many B vitamins in order to have energy to do what they need to do. And so super B is another great one that you can add in, and that we especially see pregnant moms do great with. But when pregnancy, when we start having the discussion with that, and sometimes lab work comes into the picture, you may have heard of a genetic mutation, which is fairly common, that people will talk about MTHFR. And so then it's all the more important if someone has that, which again, a large part of the population finds them with that, then we need to make sure that these vitamins are methylated. And Young Living does all of that, because we don't, you know, take something from nature and then do all these things to alter it, or just give you synthetics. And so many times prenatals not only are not whole food based, when they are whole food based, there's so many changes, there's other synthetics added in, or they're not in the right state, like what we were just saying with the B vitamins. Or, and this so often contributes to people's nausea or their indigestion, the levels and the amounts that they put in them, because they're not trusting that people are making, or even are educated on how to make a wise choice on what they need and don't need as far as what they're consuming in their diet. And so they just say, hey, we can, you know, ensure that and take care of our liability with this by making massive amounts in this vitamin. And then you take this pill and your body's like, what in the world did you just, you know, give me that like overloaded my system on, you know, whatever nutrient it was, or maybe the nutrient was so chemically synthesized and made into such a different thing that the body's like, I don't recognize this because it's not food. And so you can do whatever you want. For me personally, I love anything that we can get from food and feed the body with actual food, it makes sense to me that that's how it was created. Sometimes the stressors are so much, or in some cases the soil is so depleted, or maybe we're not able, for whatever reason, maybe it's a shipping thing or they don't grow in season thing, to get those nutrients that we need. And so in that case, then I turn to, okay, what plants and what supplements do we have to support this? And so if it's not from food and we are going to make the choice of taking a vitamin, again, how can we do it whole food based? And so I find that our multigreens, which has our bee pollen in it, it's not the royal jelly like the mineral essence, but multigreens is a phenomenal support that you could look at if you're wanting to do something more whole food based. Again, just working with your own research and maybe your provider to make sure that the levels of things that you're getting are at what you want them for. Our master formula that I was mentioned that Dr. Purser helped to develop, love that it is so easy that you can grab one little packet sachet that they come in, rip it open, take it, and you've got your multivitamin and your multimineral and your antioxidants in there. Our Ningxia, several people who have analyzed their placenta after birth, they will give it the little nickname of like the Ningxia placenta. It's the only organ that we get rid of, and obviously like can do that, and it's meant to be that way. That was the way that we're created, right? And so we can analyze and look at that organ and what does it tell us about the state that the body was in nutrient wise as it was growing that. And so many people mentioned just the health of the placenta, and obviously since that's the thing that's nourishing the baby, would stand to be that helps with the health of the baby too. And so Ningxia is phenomenal. And so we have a lot of whole food based options, and doing your own research if you're looking for something that can support you through pregnancy, if you've supported yourself through the fertile stage, and then growing your family, want to continue on that support. And so not only do you not have to change up what you have been doing in these seasons and these times, but you can continue and make some choices that better support the way that you're wanting to go with this in that season of pregnancy, and then for labor and delivery and birth and postpartum afterwards with this. And so just wanted to touch on that because it's just such a natural thing that moves into this. So I hope that was helpful. I know you have a ton of information, and so make one change at a time, whether that's one, simple thing for a body system, or whether you want to switch over one part of your house or focus on one part of your family. You can do little bits at a time, and that's how we conquer the whole goal, right? Is just a little bit at a time instead of getting overwhelmed and doing nothing, because done is better than perfect. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any specific questions or need some more works with some specific suggestions, you guys can find me on social media. We're on Facebook. I tend to see Instagram more, and so my Instagram handle is Dr. Cindy H, DrCindyH, and I would love to be of service over there for you guys, both with what I'm sharing on more education in this, and then answering if you have any specific questions that I can help you with. But thank you for spending your time with me. I don't ever take that for granted, and I hope you have enjoyed the rest of the talks in the summit. I'm so thankful for